The Verdict by Edith Wharton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rena Toby. The Verdict by Edith Wharton. June 1908. I had always thought Jack Gisburn rather a cheap genius, though a good fellow enough, so it was no great surprise to me to hear that in the height of his glory he had dropped his painting, married a rich widow, and established himself in a villa on the Riviera, though I rather thought it would have been Rome or Florence. The height of his glory, that was what the women called it. I can hear Mrs. Gideon Thwing, his last Chicago sitter, deploring his unaccountable abdication. Of course, it's going to send the value of my picture way up, but I don't think of that, Mr. Rickham. The loss to art is all I think of. The word on Mrs. Thwing's lips multiplied its R's as though they were reflected in an endless vista of mirrors. And it was not only the Mrs. Thwings who mourned. Had not the exquisite Hermia Croft, at the last Grafton Gallery show, stopped me before Gisburn's Moon Dancers to say with tears in her eyes, "We shall not look upon its like again"? Well, even through the prism of Hermia's tears, I felt able to face the fact with equanimity. Poor Jack Gisburn! The women had made him. It was fitting that they should mourn him. Among his own sex fewer regrets were heard, and in his own trade hardly a murmur. Professional jealousy? Perhaps. If it were, the honor of the craft was vindicated by little Claude Nutley, who, in all good faith, brought out in the Burlington a very handsome obituary on Jack, one of those showy articles stocked with random technicalities that I have heard, I won't say by whom, compared to Gisburn's paintings. And so, his resolve being apparently irrevocable, the discussion gradually died out, and as Mrs. Thwing had predicted, the price of Gisburn's went up. It was not till 3 years later that in the course of a few weeks' idling on the Riviera, it suddenly occurred to me to wonder why Gisburn had given up his painting. On reflection, it really was a tempting problem. To accuse his wife would have been too easy. His fair sitters had been denied the solace of saying that Mrs. Gisburn had dragged him down. For Mrs. Gisburn, as such, had not existed till nearly a year after Jack's resolve had been taken. It might be that he had married her, since he liked his ease, because he didn't want to go on painting. But it would have been hard to prove that he had given up his painting because he had married her. Of course, if she had not dragged him down, she had equally, as Miss Croft contended, failed to lift him up. She had not led him back to the easel. To put the brush into his hand again, what a vocation for a wife! But Mrs. Gisburn appeared to have disdained it, and I felt it might be interesting to find out why. The desultory life of the Riviera lends itself to such purely academic speculations, and having on my way to Monte Carlo caught a glimpse of Jack's balustraded terraces between the pines, I had myself borne thither the next day. I found the couple at tea beneath their palm trees, and Mrs. Gisburn's welcome was so genial that in the ensuing weeks I claimed it frequently. It was not that my hostess was interesting. On that point I could have given Miss Croft the fullest reassurance. It was just because she was not interesting, if I may be pardoned the bull, that I found her so. For Jack, all his life, had been surrounded by interesting women. They had fostered his art. It had been reared in the hothouse of their adulation. And it was therefore instructive to note what effect the deadening atmosphere of mediocrity, I quote Miss Croft, was having on him. I have mentioned that Mrs. Gisburn was rich, and it was immediately perceptible that her husband was extracting from this circumstance a delicate but substantial satisfaction. It is, as a rule, the people who scorn money who get most out of it, and Jack's elegant disdain of his wife's big balance enabled him, with the appearance of perfect good breeding, to transmute it into objects of art and luxury. To the latter, I must add, he remained relatively indifferent. But he was buying Renaissance bronzes and 18th century pictures with a discrimination that bespoke the amplest resources. Money's only excuse is to put beauty into circulation was one of the axioms he laid down across the Sèvres and silver of an exquisitely appointed luncheon table, when on a later day I had again run over from Monte Carlo, and Mrs. Gisburn, beaming on him, added for my enlightenment, "Jack is so morbidly sensitive to every form of beauty." Poor Jack! It had always been his fate to have women say such things of him. The fact should be set down in extenuation. What struck me now was that for the first time he resented the tone. I had seen him so often basking under similar tributes. Was it the conjugal note that robbed them of their savor? No, for oddly enough it became apparent that he was fond of Mrs. Gisburn, fond enough not to see her absurdity. It was his own absurdity he seemed to be wincing under, his own attitude as an object for garlands and incense. "My dear, since I chucked painting, people don't say that stuff about me. They say it about Victor Grindle," was his only protest, as he rose from the table and strolled out onto the sunlit terrace. I glanced after him, struck by his last word. Victor Grindle was, in fact, becoming the man of the moment, as Jack himself, one might put it, had been the man of the hour. The younger artist was said to have formed himself at my friend's feet, and I wondered if a tinge of jealousy underlay the latter's mysterious abdication. But no, for it was not till after that event that the Rose Dubarry drawing-rooms had begun to display their Grindles. I turned to Mrs. Gisburn, who had lingered to give a lump of sugar to her spaniel in the dining-room. "Why has he chucked painting?" I asked abruptly. She raised her eyebrows with a hint of good-humored surprise. "Oh, he doesn't have to now, you know, and I want him to enjoy himself," she said quite simply. I looked about the spacious white-panelled rooms, with its famille verte vases repeating the tones of the pale damask curtains, and its 18th century pastels in delicate faded frames. "Has he chucked his pictures too? I haven't seen a single one in the house." A slight shade of constraint crossed Mrs. Gisburn's open countenance. "It's his ridiculous modesty, you know. He says they're not fit to have about. He sent them all away except one, my portrait, and that I have to keep upstairs." His ridiculous modesty? Jack's modesty about his pictures? My curiosity was growing like the beanstalk. I said persuasively to my hostess, "I must really see your portrait, you know." She glanced out almost timorously at the terrace where her husband, lounging in a hooded chair, had lit a cigar and drawn the Russian deerhound's head between his knees. "Well, come while he's not looking," she said, with a laugh that tried to hide her nervousness, and I followed her between the marble emperors of the hall and up the wide stairs with the terracotta nymphs poised among flowers at each landing. In the dimmest corner of her boudoir, amid a profusion of delicate and distinguished objects, hung one of the familiar oval canvases in the inevitable garlanded frame. The mere outline of the frame called up all Gisburn's past. Mrs. Gisburn drew back the window curtains, moved aside a jardinière full of pink azaleas, pushed an armchair away, and said, "If you stand here, you can just manage to see it. I had it over the mantelpiece, but he wouldn't let it stay." Yes, I could just manage to see it, the first portrait of Jack's I had ever had to strain my eyes over. Usually they had the place of honor, say the central panel in a pale yellow or rose Dubarry drawing-room, or a monumental easel placed so that it took the light through the curtains of old Venetian point. The more modest place became the picture better, yet as my eyes grew accustomed to the half-light, all the characteristic qualities came out, all the hesitations disguised as audacities, the tricks of prestidigitation by which, with such consummate skill, he managed to divert attention from the real business of